we are starting a new series, and so I don't know how long it'll go for, but it's Perspective from the Prophets. And so if you've got a Bible with you this morning, if you've got one nearby, open it up to the book of Habakkuk, towards the end of the Old Testament, but just look it up in the index. Like, seriously, it's a tricky little book to find because there's only 3 chapters in it. So we're starting with that one this morning. Now, I would ask the question, I would suggest, more to the point, that there are questions that get asked year after year, generation after generation, century after century. One is kids asking what's for dinner. I get asked that every day, and I have young adults in the house. What's for dinner? It's a perpetually asked question. Humans in every generation ask, when will I find love? It's a question that gets rolled out with every movie and actually gets asked, often internally, by human beings. And often people everywhere from every age will ask questions like, why? Why is this happening? And they'll ask, how long? I was listening to an old Chuck Swindoll sermon this week. Oh, I love Chuck Swindoll. There's something very soothing about his manner and the way he speaks. But he suggested that those 2 questions, why and how long, have been asked for as long as questions have probably been asked. And more often than not, they're asked and not answered. And so we find as we start the book of Habakkuk, as we just enter the first couple of verses, we hear these questions asked. So in Habakkuk chapter 1, verse 2, how long, Lord, must I call for help, but you do not listen? Or cry out to you, violence, but you don't save? Why do you make me look at injustice? Why do you tolerate wrongdoing? Destruction and violence are before me. There is strife and conflict abounds. Therefore the law is paralyzed and justice never prevails. The wicked hem in the righteous so that justice is perverted. That could be written today. And the question, why and how long, has been asked right from these days and before. And so as we come to this morning, and as we realize that actually, while God gives some perspective, he doesn't directly answer those questions, I think we have something to learn from the book of Habakkuk. In fact, I know we do, because there is some gold hidden here in these first couple of chapters. And I would like to suggest that there is an alternative to asking why and how long. So just to give you a little bit of perspective, this book of Habakkuk is written, okay, I'm going to go back. I'm going to go back a step. So if we look at the kingdom of David, if we look at David's reign, it's around 1000 BC. Long time ago. And if you look at that as sort of the pinnacle of this moment in Israel's history, we see that after David we had Solomon, and after Solomon his 2 sons who are just bad news, and we see that the kingdom splits, and so 10 tribes go one way and 2 tribes go another. Now, a crocodile didn't bite them in the parts. It was political turmoil. They just could not get along. They were very self-focused. Everyone wants a grab of power, and so you have 10 kingdoms one way and 2 another. When we get to the book of Habakkuk, this is like nearly 400 years later, and already the 10 tribes, which are known as Israel, which is confusing, but those 10 tribes have already been invaded and dragged away by the Assyrians. So Habakkuk is writing about the injustice and the greed and the lack of focus on God and on each other. He's writing about these 2 tribes that are left, Judah, and he knows that this is a very precarious situation. He's saying, God, how long will we be in this mess for? Now, listen to God's response, and don't think you're going to get a huge amount of encouragement from this next bit, because what God says is, look at the nations and watch and be utterly amazed. So you're perched on the edge of your seat. What's God going to say? How is he going to resolve this conflict of this people of God who are just mistreating each other and they're mistreating the people who are most vulnerable? And what's God going to do? Well, what he's going to do in verse 5, I'm going to do something in your days that you would not believe even if you were told. I'm raising up the Babylonians. Just pause there for a second. I'm raising up the Babylonians. So Habakkuk says, this is not working. God, what's going on and how long is this going to last? And God says, don't worry. I've got it sorted. I'm bringing the Babylonians in to attack you. This is not the kind of news that Habakkuk would have liked to have heard, not by a long shot. So his question of how are you going to resolve this, the solution seems completely out of proportion to the problem. The solution is light a match and throw it in a sense. It's not what Habakkuk wants to hear. It just seems so out of proportion. I have a problem with this house, or I did a few months ago, and you might think that my solution, which I didn't go to, was out of proportion. So we had a little bit of a mouse problem, right? Just over there, we didn't realise, or I didn't realise, but Raph had pulled out some of the plugs in the wall to do some electrical work, and it was basically a highway for mice, right? So a toll-free highway to get into our home. Now, if you know me well, you'll know that I'm not one to bait, because baiting ends up out in the environment and that's no good. And I hate mouse traps because they're just scary. So we got this industrial looking mouse trap. It is a mouse trap, but it's a humane one. So the mice can go in either end, they go and eat the peanut butter, and then they're stuck because they go in and the ramp goes down and then they can't get back out again. Perfect solution, is it not? So we have this highway of mice coming in, and one by one by one, I'm catching these mice thinking, why have we got so many mice? But then the mice got really sneaky, and even though they shouldn't be able to get out because the trap's like that, don't ask me how, and I wish I could set up just this tiniest little camera, but they learned how to push down the ramp and get out. So I got cleverer than the mice, or so I thought. And so every time I'd hear this, I'd know there was a mouse in there. So I'd run over, I'd pick up the trap, I'd take it outside, and I'd release the mice in the, bushes down the road. This was working okay, even though a lot of mice were coming in, and I'm getting more and more frustrated. And if you've ever found mouse poo in your house, it's disgusting, and it was gross. You're never going to want to visit our house again, by the way, but you can't at the moment anyway, and you'll forget this story by the time it's all over. One day, I pick up the mouse trap. I'm ready to take this mouse outside before he escapes, and I decide that I'm going to put my hands on the end of the trap, because that way little mousey who's learned to push down this ramp somehow can't get out, except that the little bugger bit me. And Raph will show you a photo of that. It was awful, absolutely awful, and it bruised. It was that bad. So I run this stupid, you'll be proud of me, I ran this stupid thing outside. It didn't get out from the trap. And then as I'm stomping back in the house, I'm like, just get rid of the house. I'm done with this stupid house and these stupid mice. They can have it. It's theirs. I'll sign away the house. Well, that is how Habakkuk sees this solution. God has said, in Habakkuk's mind, God has said, enough. That's it. I'm done. It's over. I'm going to bring in people who are just going to decimate the place, and that'll be it. That actually isn't what God was saying, but that's how it felt for Habakkuk. And you see that in his second complaint. It's labelled second complaint in the chapter 1 here. And what he's basically saying is, you've got a problem. We have a problem here, God, with what the people are doing. But the solution isn't just to bring in the Babylonians, because they're awful. And they absolutely were awful. But interestingly, Habakkuk puts all that out there. He vents it, he says it, he calls it as he sees it. He says the solution is out of proportion with the problem in his mind. And so he probably feels like the way that many of us feel at the moment. He's confused about the world. He's confused about what God's doing. He's not sure why or how long. He doesn't get the solutions aren't coming in the way he thought they would. This thing is not ending. His pain won't be coming to an end. But I think he has a really, really interesting response. He says in chapter 2, verse 1, this is what he responds. I will stand at my watch and station myself on the ramparts. I will look to see what he will say to me and what answer I am to give to this complaint. In the Message version it said, I'll climb to the lookout tower and scan the horizon. And really that's our call. That's the call for how to cope with this confusion, this difficulty in the age we find ourselves in. Because if you think about that city of Jerusalem, which was where Habakkuk was writing, it had high walls to protect it. So if you're inside those walls, if you're down on the ground without perspective, you don't know what's coming. You have no social media in ancient times. You have no newspaper. You have nothing. You have no ability to see beyond the walls. And so what Habakkuk says is that both literally probably and figuratively, he gets up to the watchtower. Every city had to have a watchtower, which was in constant use because you had to be on the lookout for what was coming. He says, I'm going to the watchtower. I'm going to get some perspective and I'm going to wait to hear what God says because I have to. I really have to. It's the only thing that we can do. So this idea that Habakkuk is not going to get an answer to why or how long, he says, I'm going to stand in this place and wait. I'm going to go where I can see outside of my perspective and I'm going to wait to hear from God. So I want to ask you this morning, quite simply, what is your watchtower? What or where is your watchtower? For some of you, I know that it's early in the morning with a journal and a Bible and a coffee, and that is your opportunity to stop and to be still and to listen for God's voice, whatever that voice might be, however long that voice might take to come. I know for some of you, that's you try and do that, but it can be challenging. And for you, instead, nature is that place where you can literally just breathe in something refreshing. And I want to suggest that if nature is your thing, could you try this week either taking your phone and reading a psalm or perhaps a story of Jesus, or if you're going technology free, write something down on a piece of paper, write a psalm out, write a couple of verses out and take them with you. So as you get into nature and that is your watchtower, that is your place to hear from God, you also have his word with you. For some of you, I know it's music, and so choose carefully and choose something this week that will help you to slow down and be still and to be in that watchtower. For some of you, it's conversations, and you might be particularly challenged at the moment because you can't necessarily gather and be in those conversations and hear perspective from other people. But there's always a phone, there's always a message, there's always an opportunity to collect with someone and to connect. And even if that's just one way, even if it's just a podcast this week, let that be your watchtower. And for some, I know that there are other ways, other means, or perhaps you're not even sure what it is. But to be able to sit, reflect, wait, and be still is probably our best ammunition, our best strategy for these confusing times. And so I hope that you're able to find that. If you've neglected your watchtower, this week's your opportunity to go back to it. If you don't have a watchtower, be asking God to provide some inspiration for that place that you can go. So once Habakkuk had gone to his watchtower and gained perspective, it's interesting to see what unfolds next. And we might tackle that next week. But I do want to skip to the end, because I think as Habakkuk starts to hear just small whispers from God, and he hears perspective from God, he starts praising God. He starts remembering all that God had done in the past. And that's important too, to be able to say, this moment is really difficult, and yet I've seen God work in the past, so I will see God work again. And I want to close by praying the prayer that, or the affirmation that Habakkuk prays right at the end. These are pretty famous verses. You've probably heard them. I'm going to pray them, and then as we finish, we will finish our service by listening to